So thank you very much to Lord Deben for joining us, and over to you.
Well, thank you very much. Yes, I'm standing down in June. I ought to have gone some time ago, but I've been extended. You're only supposed to do it for 2 sets of 5 years, but I shall go at the end of June. So you've asked me in a short time just to look back over those 10 years. And sometimes that's a good idea, because if I look back, I have to say, I wouldn't have thought at the beginning of those 10 years that we'd have done as much and got as far. That's really rather important, because you constantly are prey to being depressed because people aren't doing what you know they could do, and governments aren't moving as fast as they ought to, and businesses are still pretending to do things which they're not doing. Every now and again, one has to look back and think, well, 10 years ago, I wouldn't have thought we'd have had the Paris Agreement. I wouldn't have thought that we'd have the Glasgow Accord. I wouldn't have thought that we'd have got a whole series of countries on the track to deal with climate change. I say that because look back 10 years and we were still arguing as to whether anything should be done by developing countries at all. We were still arguing about whether climate change was really happening. We were still arguing about who should do the heavy lifting. We aren't delivering yet as we should deliver. There's a huge amount to do, and there's a great lack of urgency. But at least we're beyond that argumentative stage. I don't have any longer to prove to people that climate change is happening when I'm speaking, whereas 10 years ago that used to have to be the first 10 minutes of one speech because people were simply not believing in it. So what is it that is at the heart of the change? The first thing, of course, is that people are beginning to come to terms with the fact that climate change is affecting them. It is really true that until people feel it themselves, it's quite difficult to get people to get any kind of urgency. You can see floods on the television, even floods in your own country, but if it's on the other side of the country, if it's nowhere near your friends, then you forget about it pretty quickly. But what is happening now is that people recognise that there is a whole change in the pattern of the weather. Gardeners are seeing that spring is coming 17 days early, that the blossoms come out, but the pollinators aren't there. They're beginning to recognise that the rain comes down in torrential storms rather than in sweet, refreshing showers. They remember last year's heat waves, and they recognise too that wildfires have become a much more regular factor in our lives, as have floods, and that in some years we have both floods and drought in the same year in the same place. I live in the east of England. The east of England is now officially recognised as a semi-arid part of the world. We are genuinely going to be short of water, and people are seeing that. So that's the first thing that's changed. The second thing that's changed is something that I recognise not from the Climate Change Committee, but from my business. My business is to advise people on sustainability. So we're talking about things like supply chains, about workers who are not properly paid. We're talking about modern slavery. We're talking about water supply. We're talking about pollution. We're talking about all those things that businesses now have to deal with under ESG. But what is remarkable is that up to 3 or so years ago, if you went to an investment company, venture capitalist, a bank, anybody, and started talking about sustainability, you had a very hard time. You used to have to work very hard before they recognised that this was something they would be or should be concerned of. I always found that difficult because it seemed to me that if you were investing in a business and you knew you wanted to sell it improved in 5 years' time, then you'd have thought the first thing you'd ask is it going to be here in 5 years' time, which after all is the first question of sustainability. And then you'd have to ask, is it doing the things that it needs to get its resource balance in line? Are they actually saving where they can save? And if they're not, can I buy this company more cheaply and then put that right? Sustainability seems to me to be a very important thing automatically. But it used to take us literally years to convince people that that was so. The change has been that they now come to us. They now say, we've got to do this. And there's hardly a single business in the finance world that is not doing something. Some of them are doing it in an ineffective way, and some are pretending to do it. But a very large number are now really seriously concerned with sustainability. And of course, if you're concerned about sustainability, then in general, then the particularity of climate change becomes really important. And you're beginning to see that first difference, which I mentioned, which is that climate change is really affecting all of us, having a direct effect on businesses that have now decided that sustainability is of vital interest, because they are finding that they've got to think about factories that are likely to be flooded, supply chains which may be cut off because there's no water, and goods which they expected to be grown cannot be grown. The third big change, I think, over those 10 years is that it is almost impossible to have a conversation with anybody in business or anywhere else, not just because I'm chairman of the Climate Change Committee, not just because this has been something which I've thought about right since the early 1980s, simply because everybody has had to take that into account in a way which they haven't up to now. Now, if you put those three things together, it doesn't mean that we've got very far. What it means is that we are now able to get as far as we have to. We now have the means, we have the finance, we have the commitment in the sense that people now realise something has to be done and done urgently. And we also recognise that people realise that this has an effect on them themselves. So if I look forward now for the last couple of minutes of what I have to say, looking forward, we have to speed up this whole process enormously. The report which Chris Skidmore presented to the government is crucially important in Britain for that purpose. It's a report which fits exactly what the Climate Change Committee had said in the report we did in June, but it expands and increases a number of the demands that we have made. Government has got to take that seriously. We've got to see very real movements in the delivery of the targets which we've set. And we do have to honour the government for setting the finest targets in the world. They are necessary, and we have set them. But you can have all the targets you like. If you're not delivering, there's no point in them. And we aren't delivering at the moment, except in very specific areas. We're delivering on the energy system, in the sense that we are now using much more renewable energy. We're beginning to deliver as far as transport is concerned, in the sense that we're using much more electric cars. But in almost every other area, particularly in home heating, the way in which we're dealing with insulation, particularly on land use, all these things are not being done, and the government has got to do them. And although our standards and our targets are the best in the world, there are many other countries that are doing more as far as delivery is concerned. I think leaving the European Union was a terrible mistake. It was a mistake that we'll pay for generations to come. But it's not only a mistake because of the damage it does to our economy, it's a mistake because we are no longer able to use our good influence in the largest trading group in the world. But nonetheless, the EU is moving ahead of us in what it's doing in many things. And of course, Joe Biden's remarkable Anti-Inflation Act has made a very, very big change in the world, because it will mean that the United States will be tied into the developments in fighting climate change for a very long time to come. But of course, it reminds us too that climate change and the battle against it is not all down. Much of it is up, because we're going to build a better world. The sort of world without pollution, the sort of world without fossil fuels, the sort of world that we're talking about is a wholly different world from the one we've lived in, but it's better. And one of the things we miss out on, I think, is the optimism that comes from saying, if we really do this, we will have achieved something which is far better than the world we live in now. I very much appreciate the work done by the Pope in his remarkable encyclical, now 6 years old, Laudato Si. And in that, he talks about climate change, I think, in the most intelligent way of anyone. Climate change, he says, is not the disease, it's the symptom of the disease. It's the symptom of what we've done to the world. It's what we've done as far as pollution of the seas, pollution of the oceans, pollution of the air. It's what we've done about the way we've treated other people. It's what we've done about removing the fertility of the soil. It's what we've done in treating the world as if it didn't matter, and other people as if they didn't matter. And we've got to learn again that we have to conserve and sustain, and we have to shepherd, and we have to be stewards of the planet which gives us life. And I believe we're beginning to do that. So it's things like regenerative farming, which really give one hope. It's about thinking much more seriously about biodiversity. And in those areas where governments are beginning now to recognise that we have to recover the biodiversity that we've lost if we are in fact to fight climate change and solve the problems which we ourselves have created. So I'm optimistic. I think we can do it, but we're not doing it now. And our job is to make sure that the government's feet are kept to the fire. And it's not just the government, it's the opposition too, because the opposition still hasn't produced a programme where you could say, my goodness, they do better. And it's easier in opposition to be green. That's one of the facts of life. It's always been true. And I'm looking for the opposition too to be much more precise, much better in opposing, much better at bringing these issues up, and much more imaginative. One of the problems today, I think, is a lack of imagination among our politicians, as well as a lack of honesty among some of them. And the truth is that we have, in fact, to recover that excitement which can come of building a better world. And if we talk about it in those terms, then the misery that some people think they face will be expunged. We're not asking people to be colder and less travelled. We're not asking people to be more miserable. We're asking them to join with us in building a better world. And that world will be a world without pollution, and a world which treats people in a wholly different way, and a world which recognises that it has to conserve and be a steward rather than to rape and to destroy.